So what is a plant anyway? We provisionally defined a plant as a multicellular living organism of the kind exemplified by trees, shrubs, herbs, grasses, ferns, and mosses, typically growing rooted in a permanent site, absorbing water and inorganic substances through its roots and synthesizing nutrients in its leaves by photosynthesis using the green pigment chlorophyll. But the world of plants is so much more diverse than that. Some plants aren't ever rooted in one particular permanent place. Instead, they float around. Consider the lowly duckweed, species in the genus Lemna, a tiny aquatic plant, usually no bigger than your pinky nail. These are very common in ponds and shallow shores of lakes, especially where the water is enriched with nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen. Their leaves float on the surface of the water, and their roots dangle down, soaking up nutrients from that water, not from soil. So we've debunked the growing rooted in a permanent site part of that definition. Some tiny aquatic plants don't even have roots at all. The smallest vascular plants on Earth are called water meals because they resemble grains like cornmeal. Even without roots, they absorb nutrients very efficiently and have about 60% more protein than your average soybean. It's widely cultivated and eaten as a vegetable in Thailand and other Southeast Asian countries, and it's used as a fertilizer in many African countries, and it is found here in New England. So now we don't necessarily need the word roots in that definition either. Now consider the question, do all plants photosynthesize? Nope. There are two types of plants that rely wholly or partially on nutrients they derive from other plants or from fungi in order to survive. And some are common in New England. You may recognize this species. The first kind are called Haustorial parasites because they attach to a host plant and suck out nutrients from the tissues of that plant using special structures called haustoria. Examples in our region include species of dodder, that is, species in the genus Cuscuta, parasitic vines that twine around a host, sometimes in great masses. And you can tell that this plant is probably not photosynthetic because it contains very little in the way of green tissues. Another example, somewhat rarer in our area, is called dwarf mistletoe, Archaeothobium pusillum, a tiny plant that parasitizes conifers such as spruce, pine, and tamarack. Still another, more common example is beech drops, Epiphagus virginiana, which burrows its haustoria into the roots of American beech trees. The second kind of fully parasitic, non-photosynthesizing plants are called Mycoheterotrophs. Myco from the Greek word for fungus, and heterotroph meaning an organism that does not produce its own food. In contrast, autotrophs manufacture their food via photosynthesis, not by feeding on other organisms. Mycoheterotrophs garner all their nutrients and carbohydrates from fungi. These can be fungi that are associated with the roots of trees and other plants. These are known as mycorrhizae, like the one pictured on the left diagram. You can see how it's burying its own tissues into the roots of trees, and it will provide nutrients to that tree. And on the upper right, you can see a pine root that has been colonized by mycorrhizae. In the case of mycoheterotrophs, the parasitic plant is essentially stealing nutrients from the fungus that would otherwise have benefited the tree. Alternatively, some fungi are simply the ones involved in breaking down detritus, such as decaying leaves. Examples of mycoheterotrophs abound in New England, including the common, ghostly Indian pipe, Monotropha uniflora, that you often see on forest floors in late summer. Now, all orchid species depend on a relationship with mycorrhizae while they're germinating and getting established as seedlings. Some orchids, such as the spotted coral root, Corella maculata, spend their whole lives getting everything they need from fungi and have no photosynthetic tissues. Okay, so now we've demolished the notion that plants always have chlorophyll and photosynthesize. During their billion or so years of evolution, plants have evolved many different means of obtaining what they need from their environment and have taken on many fantastical shapes and forms. So, can we come up with a better definition that embraces all of this diversity? Perhaps the best one I've seen is from the good old Merriam-Webster dictionary. Any member of the kingdom Plantae of multicellular, eukaryotic, mostly photosynthetic organisms, typically lacking locomotive movement or obvious nervous or sensory organs, and possessing cell walls of cellulose. Right. Let's translate that into English. Plants are classified into a group of species that share similar characteristics, and that broad group is called the kingdom Plantae. It consists of flowering seed plants, conifers, also known as gymnosperms, ferns and their relatives, and mosses. Algae, like seaweeds, used to be lumped into this kingdom, but it turns out they really belong in their own. Multicellular means having many cells, rather than an organism consisting of only one cell, such as a bacterium or single-celled algae called diatoms. Eukaryotic. This refers to the types of cells that make up the organism. Eukaryotic cells, like the one on the left, have a distinct nucleus bound in a membrane. We contrast these types of cells with much simpler prokaryotic cells, like the one on the right, that don't have such a bound nucleus. Now, note that the definition we're using right now qualifies the word photosynthetic with mostly, reflecting the fact that not all plants perform photosynthesis. Plants lack locomotive movement, that is, they don't move around under their own steam across the landscape. They stay rooted, generally, in one place, or one water body. The only walking trees we know of are found currently in J.R.R. Tolkien books. Go Ents. Next, the phrase lacking obvious nervous or sensory organs could be a bit controversial. We may talk about plant senses a little later in the course, but it is true that these are not really organs per se, and they're certainly not obvious, except perhaps to this poor mealworm who is about to get eaten by a Venus flytrap. And we saw in week 1 how the marvelous cell walls that give plant cells their strength and flexibility are in fact made up of cellulose, the world's most abundant polymer. So I think this definition kind of summarizes up plants pretty handily. Go out and discover the incredible diversity of the plants that share the earth with us.